12, Soaring in his hands. The preacher's wife. If I told you that time was a temporal space, would you believe? How real is the supernatural? Is it merely fictional, or is there more to what meets the eye, and perhaps the mind? 2 months ago, although I would have said yes, I believed, I would not have answered with enough conviction. Yes, conviction. That is the difference now. Something happened, and my unphysical world became more real to me than what my eyes could see. Sweetie was a pet name my father usually called me by, which became even more known than my real name. He pastored a small church in Lashibi, a small town in Ghana, which is a couple of minutes' drive from the capital. My dad was rarely home, but I loved him, and although I vowed not to marry a pastor, I ended up married to his young friend, who was a very calm and quiet preacher. He barely spoke about anything, and will usually only smile, especially when he seemed triggered. He was a very sensitive man, and as such, my father always warned me to try as much as possible to stay away from him when his body language signaled. Imagine, my own husband or... Well, I obeyed, being the understanding wife and partner I am. I never disturbed him. Okay, maybe a few times, I must confess. Being raised by a pastor and being married to a pastor are two separate experiences. Something quite peculiar. My husband was fond of something quite peculiar. He would usually kiss me every hour or two to midnight on my forehead and whisper, "Going out, we'll be right back." Perhaps he perceived that I was fast asleep, but I wasn't. I always heard him, even anticipated it each night. I never followed up. I just trusted that he would be fine, and then waited till he returned a few minutes after midnight. One of those nights, I decided to get a glass of water after my husband had kissed me goodbye, and I realized something strange. He was not really gone. I heard him in the guest room. I began to wonder if he always spent those hours there, because all along I had believed that he left the compound. I sat in the corridor leading to our bedroom, waiting for him to come out, and after 2 hours he did. There was something about him when I saw him. He looked pure, his skin felt like something that doesn't have a word to describe it. His eyes looked like fresh water, and when I hugged him, his pulse felt like a calculated and precise rhythm. I didn't have to ask him what happened there. I just knew it, and that was enough an answer for me. I thought I would have questions, but when he walked towards me, I just felt content. 2 months later, my husband arrived home from a meeting and told me about a trip he needed to make to Nairobi, Kenya. He was honoring an invitation to minister at a crusade, of which I decided to escort him. For what reason? I just did not want to be home alone. He did not seem to agree with me coming, yet he didn't argue about it. He only asked me if I was sure about the decision I was making, and for some funny reason, my heart skipped 1,000 beats. I became unsure all of a sudden, but I just very much wanted to go with him, considering that we had never traveled together, even after we got wedded. The Kenyan church had arranged a chartered flight for us. All we needed to do was to get on board and enjoy the flight. It was my first time on a private aircraft, and it felt good, especially the aura of importance that hung around us in the airport. We were about 10 people aboard the plane. The pilots, flight attendants, 2 other visiting evangelists from Abidjan, myself and my husband. The plane left the tarmac in Accra at around 10 p.m. and was scheduled to land in Nairobi in approximately 4 hours. The weather was conducive, the jet was in perfect condition, the pilots were white men, and for me, that was enough consolation and assurance that everything was going to be all right. But yes, you guessed right. Something happened that changed my life forever. The turbulence. My husband had been engaged in a conversation with the evangelist from the very hour we left Accra until it was about 11 p.m. Ghanaian time. I cannot explain how he managed to pick a rapport with them, with regards to the fact that I had never heard him speak French. Well, I minded my business until he returned to his original seat next to me. He squeezed my hand teasingly and then smiled widely. He then passed a comment that rather made me lose my sleep for the few hours we had left on the aircraft. I may go out. Whatever happens, don't call me. Just talk to God. You will be okay. I instantly freaked out so much that I almost yelled his first name. Where in the heavens could he be going when we were more than 30,000 feet above sea level? He noticed that I became uncomfortable, but he was not perturbed one bit. He only held onto my hand and then leaned back into his seat. Before I could say another word, he'd already drowned into deep slumber. I tried to get myself collected and remain calm, yet it wasn't exactly working. It was a couple of minutes to midnight, and the low temperature of the air condition was freezing my fingers, numbing them, and as I unclenched my fingers from my husband's, the turbulence rocked the jet, almost tossing me over to the floor. It was terrifying. Everyone panicked and began to pray except my husband, who was far gone. At exactly midnight, one of the engines failed, which we all literally felt. The captain of the plane tried to keep composure to relax our nerves as I began to recite Psalm 91 solemnly beneath my breath. I shook my husband's hand rigorously, but he wouldn't wake up. He wouldn't even flinch. I immediately remembered his words that if anything should happen, I must not call him, and so I began to talk to God. As soon as I gathered the courage to say, "Dear Lord," the oxygen masks deployed from the ceiling of the jet, and that drove me even crazier. I knew we were in big trouble. Before the next minute, the other engine stopped functioning, and all we could hear were emergency beeps. The wings of the plane began to tilt in a very obvious and frightening fashion. The nose of the plane tilted towards the ground, and we all knew we were gradually going down. The evangelists unbuckled their seatbelts and laid prostrate as though they were praying. I held firmly onto my husband's hand in hopes that he would open his eyes, but no. And there I was dumbfounded. Peace like a river. At exactly 5 minutes past 12 midnight, he opened his eyes suddenly. It looked peaceful, like a river. His palms felt warm, like he had been under the sun, and his skin was just... I still cannot describe it, but yes, he felt different. He looked like he had been somewhere. By this time, the plane was descending a little faster than usual, and what happened next changed my entire perspective of God. My husband did not panic. He only closed his eyes, opened his palms, and like a bolt from a blue, a mysterious hand held the plane straight and carried it. It was like nothing I had ever experienced in my life. Were the engines revived? Absolutely not. All we felt was as though we were in a palanquin, with a giant hand carrying us to wherever it wanted. In that moment, we cared less about where we were going. All that mattered were the tears in our eyes and the worship on the plane. Our British pilots who weren't Christian fell on their knees as tears dripped down the corners of their eyes onto their seats. Our lips could not utter a word. All we did was cry throughout, and that was the most acceptable worship our spirits could offer God, in whose hand we literally soared in. When we arrived in Nairobi, the spirit in the congregation was charged, and after a few minutes of the sermon by my husband, every single soul was seated with tears flooding every eye and the same hand touching everyone. I saw it with my eyes. The power of God moved in such a unique, silent way, without songs, without musical instruments, without shouting. Just a silent breeze, and all we could do was to cry intimately. Our flight back to Accra was the smoothest, and for the first time, all I could think of was God. Not even my husband. I just craved God more and more. The beauty of His presence and His existence was more satisfying than anything my mind could conceive. Honey, I want to talk to God like you do, I asked my husband. So talk to Him, he responded rather simply. No, I mean, like you do. How do you do it? I actually do nothing. He does it all. So how do I start? Sweetie, just go to Him and wait, and He will show up. In His own way. Just wait. My husband smiled. After what I had seen on that plane, you could bet that I was not going to let this go. He must show up. The end.